Okay, can everybody hear? Okay, great. Okay, so there's a handout coming around. And probably there's redundancy. If there's any conflict in my presentation of Michael's paper, go with Michael's handout. So I'd like to start just by saying it's a very rich, probing paper. Starts with this exploration of control over action, and then sees to what extent that sort of picture can be transposed to the case of omissions. Okay, so let me just begin by just kind of summarizing the big picture of the paper. So part one is this, we get this picture of control over actions. It's a picture in which we have direct control over what Michael calls executive decisions, but that's to be understood quite broadly. So decisions, tryings, other kinds of volitions, choosings, and that sort of thing. So we have direct control over that, and then we have a kind of hybrid control over the actions, like raising your hand or turning on the light. Okay, so that's the kind of picture, and then this kind of hybrid control over actions is to be understood in terms of counterfactuals of a certain kind. Okay, so we'll get into that detail in a bit. Michael begins to build a case for the idea that direct control over the executive decisions themselves could be understood in terms of a different kind of counterfactual, but he doesn't insist on this, one of the ways in which the paper is so judicious. Okay. In the second part of the paper, Michael then distinguishes between two kinds of omissions, what I'll call active omissions, that centrally feature the agents deciding not to do something, and contrast those with what I think even Michael calls passive omissions, which are ones in which the agent simply fails to make a decision of any kind and omits to perform an action. Okay, so as Michael shows, the picture of action control given in the first part of the paper, it nicely transposes to active omissions, because in both cases you start with a kind of executive decision. In one case that's followed by an action, in another an omission. Okay, so that works out really well. The hard case is the case of passive omissions, where it looks like there isn't anything corresponding to the decision other than a kind of lack of decision. Okay, so the big question is, do we have control in those cases? And here Michael says very honestly he's unsure. This made it hard for me to be a commentator because I too am unsure, and you're supposed to disagree, and I'll do my best to disagree with some things here and there, but I think, and especially after talking to Michael last night, I think we're sort of in agreement about our uncertainty, but we sort of lean in the same direction about a lot of cases as well. Okay, so Michael ends up leaving this question open. He suggests that there's at least one natural argument against the idea that we have such control. He's tempted by it, but he thinks it fails. And he offers the thermostat control as a kind of motivating analogy that could provide support for the idea that we do have control in passive omissions cases. Okay. But again, ultimately, the question is left open. And in the final part of the paper, Michael explains just how important it is to get clear on this question. Okay. So in what follows, I'm going to disagree about some of the picture of control and action that Michael presents, but I'll ultimately try to employ the same kind of strategy that Michael does in using insights from the case of action to help illuminate the case of passive omissions. Okay. So on the handout here in section 2, I just reproduced Michael's helpful figure 1, which sets out or sort of illustrates the picture of action here. And the idea is that, again, we have direct control over the decision to raise one's hand, little a. We have indirect control over the results of that decision, like just the rising of one's hand. And then we have this sort of hybrid control over the action of raising one's hand, or the turning on the light, or what have you. Okay. And then the hybrid control is, as I mentioned earlier, to be understood in terms of the ability to see to it that I do the action and the ability to see to it that I don't. So in other words, it requires this kind of dual ability. And in turn, each of these abilities is going to be cashed out in terms of counterfactuals. So on the handout, I just put this as a first pass. I think this is Michael's first pass, counterfactual 1 and counterfactual 2. So if I have control over the raising of my hand, these are true. If I were to decide to raise it in this way, I would raise it in this way, but it's also the case that if I were to decide otherwise, I wouldn't raise it in this way. Okay, that's a good first pass. But y'all are now all very familiar with Austin's putting example. That poses a kind of problem because it looks like Austin has the ability, right? He's kicking himself, but and yet these counterfactuals clearly seem untrue because he did decide, he chose to make the putt and he didn't. Okay. So Michael considers various kinds of ways of fixing the counterfactuals that will avoid this kind of counterexample. And he comes up with one that seems to work, something like this. If I were to decide to stand just so and to move my putter just so, I would hold the putt. Okay. And it looks like that could still be true in Austin's case. And so you could still have it that one of these kind of attitude behavior conditionals or AB conditionals is a necessary condition for control. Okay, so that's the pieces of the picture of control in action. And I just want to raise a few challenges to this picture. So the first idea is that even if this is right, that a necessary condition of control is that some kind of counterfactual like this is true, even if it's true, it looks like its relevance for control has to rest on something else, something deeper in virtue of which it's true. And to see this, I can tell you, I don't know that I've ever, I've played mini golf, but I've never actually played real golf. Anyway, it might be true of me that I could make a putt if I decided to stand just so and all of the things in the antecedent of the conditional, but and it might be true that if I did all those things, I actually would make it. But that would just be like amazingly lucky. Like I would never think to make those decisions or anything like that. So the conditionals might be true of me, but I don't think it indicates anything about my control. Okay, so if it does indicate something about Austin's, I think it's because Austin has some kind of skill, and then that's what's generating these counterfactuals. So there's something deeper in virtue of which the counterfactuals are true. Okay, and related to this point, I think we want not only a necessary condition for control, but if we're really trying to get at the explication of control, I think we want either necessary and sufficient conditions or something to characterize control more fully. Now, I think for Michael's project, it could still be really useful if we had even a necessary condition of control in the action case, and then we thought it doesn't apply in our passive omissions case. Well, that would be really interesting. We would know. We would actually realize we didn't have something necessary for control. But here I think it's really subtle because we'd have to be sure it was a necessary condition of control, period, and not just control for actions. So dialectically, it's tricky. Okay, and then just thirdly, I guess I would raise a question for Michael's claim that decision is the locus of control, or that it is necessarily. So even when it comes to actions, it looks like, well, we don't always sort of start with a decision. So the picture, I like these figures, but I don't know that that's always the way it is, that we start with an executive decision. So, just in speaking the sentences, hopefully I'm speaking in complete sentences, but either way, the words coming out of my mouth, I'm not making an executive decision first, but it seems like I have at least quite a bit of control over what I'm doing. And so it looks like if we're not starting with a condition, if we're not starting with a decision or, something in that general ballpark, it's not clear that these conditionals, these AB conditionals, are really going to capture control in all instances. Okay. Okay, but that's an interesting, if that's right, it's an interesting insight, and we might be able to use that when it comes to passive omissions where we're also missing decisions, it looks like. Okay, so moving to section 4 on the handout. So the whole puzzle is that it looks like we have an account of control in action, But what do we do when it comes to passive omissions, where we don't have the sort of the crucial element of decision? Now that I've just convinced you in 1 minute that that's okay, we don't need decisions to have control. Have I solved the problem? Is everything okay now? Can we have control over passive omissions? And alas, no, I don't think that's true. So to see why, or just sort of one way of seeing why, I want to make a further distinction. It's not one that Michael makes in the paper, but I'm really curious as to what he thinks about it. And that's a distinction between omissions without decisions, or passive omissions, where one is aware that one can decide to do something or decide not to. Maybe this is a bit like Dirk's case from yesterday. You know, you might even think, oh, I could decide to stop and help that person change the tire, but then you just don't, right? So you're aware, but you don't actually decide, but you're sort of aware of the possibilities, and you have the ability and opportunity and all the rest. Okay, so that's one kind of case. And then a second case is the case, maybe more like the horrible case. It's hard even to think about, that we thought about so much yesterday. Leaving the child in the backseat of the car, when you're not even thinking about that you have a decision to make. Okay. So just a couple of questions about each kind of case, just to sort of for further thought. So one is kind of addressed to Michael specifically. Why think that omissions of that sort are not in our control? So you might think, well, that's enough. As long as I've got the ability and the opportunity and the awareness, even if I don't make an active decision or choice or trying or anything like that, maybe that's just sufficient. Intuitively, it seems like it shouldn't be so hard. Okay, so there's just a kind of question for Michael that I'll leave for him. And then the second kind of case, I think, is even harder to make the case that we have control in this case, where you just don't even think about things. So here I'm just offering two kinds of reasons you might think that you might say, oh, okay, maybe we don't require awareness for control, so maybe we can kind of rescue control for this kind of case too. So one kind of reason is this idea that if you think that you're in control of whether you do acquire awareness, then maybe you think, okay, that's all that's needed to attribute a kind of indirect control to whether one performs an action or omits to do so. And if you were to try to take this strategy, you could say, maybe the parallel in the action case could actually help you here. So we don't need a sort of prior decision. When you start acting, often there is no prior decision, and maybe the ability to acquire awareness, maybe it's sort of relevantly similar to that sort of case. Okay, a related move, and I think this came up yesterday as well, is to appeal to a kind of tracing of a certain kind. So in cases where you don't have awareness, you could try to trace that control to something beforehand. And I think this may be where Michael and I would differ, where he would sort of want to trace it to a decision or a volition or something like that. I'm thinking, well, maybe you could just trace it to one of these moments where you were aware of your opportunities and abilities and didn't take them. Okay. And then second, there's been, I think, some really interesting discussion of unconscious control lately, and Michael is onto at least some of this. It looks like there's all this evidence that we're controlling things without being conscious, like most of our lives are like this. And so you might think you could appeal to some of this for help in thinking that that consciousness or awareness is not actually required. But I'll end with this final question about that. I mean, I think that kind of case does pose a really interesting question about the relationship between awareness and control. But I think it raises this further question of just what kind of control we're talking about. So there's the, controlling a process, where I think it's very natural to speak of control, and these analogies with thermostats seem very relevant to me. But it's not clear that that kind of control requires anything like a dual ability, or at least this is a question. So it seems an open question whether that kind of control is really the same kind of control that we're interested in when we're thinking about moral obligation and responsibility. Okay, so just throw out a question of what kind of control are we looking for? Okay, so ending with lots of questions, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Dana. I'll just be brief in response, since I think I took too much time beforehand. Regarding what Dana has said on page 2 of her handout, that she claims not to have control over holding the putt, whereas Austin does. I would simply draw the distinction between simple and intentional control there, I think, and say that if Austin has a certain kind of skill, then if he succeeds in holding the putt, it will have been intentionally hold, whereas if you succeed, it would not have been intentionally hold. So I don't think there's a big problem there. It's something true of you that makes it the case that you have simple control over holding the putt, and something true of Austin that makes it the case that he has intentional control over doing so. I agree with you that it'd be nice not just to have necessary but sufficient conditions for what it is to be in control and exercise control. I was just worried about the necessary conditions, but there's this further worry about what else might be necessary, if anything, in order to suffice for control. So that, I agree with that. The business about decisions being the locus of the exercise of control, I'm not sure to what extent I disagree with you. That's because I'm not sure what I really mean by a decision. It's an intentional, it's something with intentional content. I don't mean it necessarily to be a prior decision to action, because the way I conceive of it in the figures I've given you, it's the first part of an action rather than something that precedes the action. I mean, I have in mind the idea that when I raise my hand, this is Wittgenstein's old question, well, what more is being added to the claim that my hand rises when we claim that I raise my hand? And the something more is something like, I make my hand rise. And the picture that I have in mind is so the hand rising is what von Wright calls the result, which is internal to the action, but something else is also needed internal to the action to make it a raising of a hand, I think. And that's why I have the pictures I have. And the first element is this decision, what I call a decision, but it's part of the action. So there needn't be any prior intentional decision in order to raise it. It could be spontaneous. Right? And whether it really warrants being called a decision, I'm not sure. It might be simply having an intention, but I do want it to be not just the passive coming to have an intention, because then it's passivity all over again. So I'm not sure how to distinguish agency from mere passivity. There must be something active going on in an action, and I don't know what that is, but I do mean the first element to be something active, and for that reason I called it a decision, but it might simply be something less robust than what we normally think of a decision as being. So I'm not sure whether I disagree with you about that. And then finally, whether you thought mere awareness might be sufficient. Yeah, but then if I'm aware, for example, I'm not sure just what the case was, if I'm aware that I could do something and I don't, must I make a decision not to do it, or do I simply make no decision to do it? Again, I'm not sure just what to say there, in part because I take it the awareness involves a kind of intention not to do the thing in question, or is it you simply haven't arrived at an intention? I don't know what to say. But the point remains, and I think we're in agreement on this also, that it's those tricky omissions that were being discussed so much yesterday, where there isn't even that element of awareness that are so bothersome. Right. Okay.
Thanks. I wanted to ask you about, you didn't say a lot about it, but just curious, the part where you were discussing omissions and how the causal history would go, just by mirroring the causal history in the case of action, and you said, so each one of the links is a genuine event, and the motivation for that was something like, it's not just the absence of the switch being in a certain position, because that could happen in a world where there is no switch, or something
Right.
like that.
Right.
It's the switch having a certain property. I take it would have to be a negative property, but at any
Right.
rate. So one thing that came to mind is that you can have omissions that happen even if the result in question, the result being the state of the world just by itself, without including the agent in any way, even if that result still obtains. So it might well be that some other agent flips the switch, even if I, perhaps completely intentionally, decide to fail to flip the switch.
Ah.
Right? So I want not to flip the switch myself. I want someone else to do it. So I don't do it, but the switch is still flipped. So then what you need there as a result is not the switch not being flipped, because it is flipped in the actual world. You need something like the switch not being flipped by me, and it's a little bit more tricky to see how that's, like an intrinsic property of the switch, or
No, that's really
something
good.
like that.
That hadn't occurred to me. Right, so that's really good. So I can omit to flip the switch, but the switch is flipped, right? Right. And that presumably can be true both of intentional and unintentional omissions, right? Right. Thank you. I don't know what to say. So that requires yet another kind of figure. Or maybe that just shows that figure 3 is mistaken from the start.
I mean, I think all it shows is that, at least that argument for the idea that there's a negative event there, that there's an event of some kind, doesn't work. So maybe you should just go with absences of some kind.
Which are?
So the result is something like the state of affairs that consists in your not flipping the switch.
But, and is causation at work here?
I don't know.
Okay.
I wish I did.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Okay. Thank you. I'll have to think some more about that. It's a good observation.
So I was wondering, oh sure, I'm Alex Sarch, I'm a postdoc at USC. So I was just wondering about the possibility of, or to see what you thought about the possibility that, so we might have, so take passive omissions, right? I wonder if maybe there's a sense in which we have indirect control over passive omissions. And so, right, the thought is that we've got direct control over the decision to do something, and it seems like we've got indirect control over the results, right? And even indirect control over results you don't know will flow from your action, so like the night prowler example. So I wonder if not deciding to X, for example, could be handled in a similar kind of way.
Oh, I think it can be.
Okay.
So I don't want to say there cannot be responsibility for passive omissions. My concern was whether there can be direct responsibility for passive omissions. If we can have negative events being caused by positive events, and if the passive omission is a negative event which somehow can be traced causally back to some prior decision, then I don't think there's any problem with that. That would just be indirect. My concern was just, is it possible to exercise direct control over a passive omission? And that's what I am unsure of still.
Thanks.
16. Holly Smith. Michael, I can think of cases, this has to do with the dual aspect of control. So I can think of cases in which it's true that I can do A, but it's not true that I have control over my doing A in the following sense. So I can blink my right eye, but I have a tic or a tremor so that when I decide not to tick my right eye, to blink my right eye, nonetheless, sometimes it blinks.
Right.
And I can think of cases where that would be morally relevant. So suppose I have a co-conspirator, and my signal to my co-conspirator that he should, not assassinate somebody or whatever is my not blinking. And I decide not to blink, and indeed I'm lucky in this case, I don't blink. Am I responsible then? I mean, have you thought about those kinds of cases?
Well, it sounds like a Frankfurt kind of case.
No, I could be a Frankfurt kind of case. There could be an intervener. But no, this is...
No, but I mean a sort of blocking version of a Frankfurt case. I mean, is the case one where the signal is not to blink, or the signal is to blink?
The signal is not to blink.
And you succeed in not blinking?
And I succeed in not blinking. I decide not to blink. I succeed in not blinking. That's the signal.
And could you have blinked?
I could have blinked, yes.
Okay, so why didn't you have dual control?
I can blink whenever I want to. If I want to blink, I will blink.
Right.
Whenever I want not to blink, sometimes I don't blink and sometimes I do, because I have this tic or tremor or something like that.
But in this particular case?
In this particular case, I'm lucky. I decide not to blink and I don't blink.
But then it seems you had control in that particular case because the tremor didn't kick in, or the tic didn't kick in?
It didn't kick in, yeah. Okay, so you'd want to say in that case, because I was lucky, I did have control.
I think so, unless I'm missing something.
Yeah.
I mean, in other cases where the signal is not to blink and unfortunately you blink because of the tic,
Yeah.
then that wasn't in your control at that point.
Okay.
But in this case, you luckily did have control because the tic didn't manifest itself.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe, I mean, you might even say it's the difference between whether I have general control over this or
Right.
not.
No, I see. Oh, well, okay. Sorry. Good. So I said in the paper that specific ability requires general ability plus opportunity. Randy has some reasons for denying that, and I think and they might be good. I just brushed over that, and this might be such a case where, in some sense, you don't have the general ability to refrain from blinking, however that's to be understood. But in this case, you have the specific ability. So it's
Okay.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, good.
Sitting here musing which of the three questions to ask you, and being indecisive, let me ask all three as fast as I can. So you and I and others are in a minority giving a conditional analysis of ability these days if we go to the action cases. But I'm with you. It seems to me Austin has to have success conditions as at least a necessary concomitant of having the ability, particular, to sink the putt.
Okay.
If you wanted to enlighten us about any of the moves you make about the 55 years of philosophy that have gone against that analysis since '61, that would be great, like the red candy problems, the finks and masks, the need for a regress not of Chisholm's
I will
kind.
defer to Randy on that. He's the
Well,
expert.
except he doesn't join us on the conditional
No, I know,
analysis.
but
Anyway, the second one is on the intentional omissions, you make a commitment to negative events,
Yeah.
presumably to negative properties and to negative states of affairs. Those are
Yeah.
really expensive items in the
Yeah, I know.
ontology store.
I know.
You could, I think you alluded to how you could make sense of what are essentially prevention cases, where the absence stands in the putative effect position rather than the putative cause position. You can make sense of that by a counterfactual dependency relationship that itself supervenes on a causal relationship between positive events. The positive event, that is being the effect, being inconsistent with the presence of the thing that is absent.
okay.
So
Okay.
you don't have to pay that much money. in the ontology store to get what you want on intentional omissions, where you get, I think, the right conclusion.
I'd be happy to pay less if I knew the details, and maybe you could let me know sometimes what those details are.
The third
I mean,
thing
you
is
just-
on the unintentional omissions. What if you and I actually did do Randy's analysis with the control and cognitive conditions, but did it conditionally in the way that he doesn't want to do it because abilities for him are primitive? Then I take it the control condition, as he calls it, is easy. Namely, you'll give a conditionalist analysis saying he could have done A, the action he omitted, if and only if he would have done A if he had adverted to the need to do so and actually decided to do so. Now we have to fill out what conditions there are for the abilities to decide, which
Yeah,
you do.
yeah.
But what you don't do is the ability to advert, and
Right.
that seems crucial.
Yeah.
And what would you think of the following conditional? Namely, he would have adverted, he could have adverted to some feature that makes A wrong, or the need to do A in the case of omissions. He could have adverted, if and only if he would have adverted, if, and now you fill in the condition that the character theorists have. It's not that he desired more than not, as in the case of intentional omissions. It's that he doesn't care enough about people.
Yeah.
That seems to be the obvious candidate for
Right.
that second conditional.
Right.
Sorry, long question.
Well, with respect to that last part, the reason I hesitate to account for could have adverted in that way is that my inclination, although I don't know how to substantiate it, is to say that unless you're in control of whether you advert, then you're not in control of doing the action in question. Now, I don't know how to defend that, though, because, as I said in the paper, there's a general principle which would have that implication, but the general principle is far too strong, namely that one is in control of X only if one is in control of every event upon which X is contingent. But I mean, that's an impossibly strong condition. And so that can't be right. And so it may be that, in some sense, I could be in control of an omission to which I'm not adverting, on the condition that if I were to advert and so forth. I frankly just don't know what to say about this. I mean, I'm torn because there are cases like the Coma case, for example, where it's true that if I were to decide to raise my hand, I would, and if I decide not to, if I were to decide to raise my hand, I would, and if I were to decide not to raise it, I wouldn't. But I'm not in control because I'm not in control of whether I decide, and that seems to me. I mean, this is an old move, but it's like Chisholm and others, but it seems to me decisive. I'm not in control of whether I raise my hand, even though those conditionals are true. So there, the lack of control over raising is to be traced to the lack of control over deciding. But we cannot, as I've just admitted, trace lack of control over of action to lack of control over all the conditions upon which the action is contingent, because that would make control impossible. So I just don't know what to think about that kind of suggestion. But I understand the motivation for it. Yeah.
So on whether direct control can be understood conditionally, so one could accept that the conditions, I guess 4 conditions that you propose for direct control are necessary, but I'm wondering if this shows that direct control is, as you put it, to be understood as consisting in the truth of conditionals. So there's one kind of case that seems to me to be very important, namely the case where the reasons are in equipoise.
Yeah.
So for example, my student is deciding between Stanford Law without any money and Berkeley Law with a free ride. And these reasons weigh equally to me. And he's having a hell of a time deciding, but I'm completely confident that in the end he'll exercise direct control, going one way or the other, without, even if one set of reasons never appears stronger than the other. So can a case like that be understood conditionally? Well, what's the condition? If the reasons are equal in this case, I might go one way or I might go the other way. But that conditional certainly doesn't express direct control, because the truth of that conditional is compatible with absence of direct control.
No, I agree. So I don't have much confidence in those conditionals. I was just pointing out that perhaps some conditionals something in that area might do the work, but I certainly don't have confidence in any of the ones that I've mentioned.
It seems to me that in this kind of case, the equipoise case, it's just impossible to be a conditional that expresses it. So I think that...
Take the reasons out, maybe just, yeah.
Even in the case of, if you do it for motivations, for example, I mean, you can have a situation in which the motivations are equal, and we're just confident that an exercise of direct control is
Okay,
possible.
so you mean, so...
And that doesn't require the truth of indeterminism either. I mean,
No, right. So this is what, a general argument against any such
yeah,
proposal?
I think so. I think so. So I think in the end you got to revert to, I guess overall I think it's just a, I guess I'm opposed to understanding this notion conditionally as opposed to in terms of powers. I think maybe that's the way Randy wants to go. And that's part of the kind of grand, like, Humean project of understanding all powers in terms of conditionals, to which we at Cornell are opposed.
Yeah. Okay. No. Okay. Point well taken. I'm not proposing that all powers can be analysed in terms of such conditionals. On the contrary, I just tentatively put out some of these. Right. I was saying that I think there's good reason to say that indirect and hybrid control can be accounted for in terms of some such conditionals. I left it open whether direct control could be. You're suggesting not. Michael is suggesting maybe. I need to look more at the details to try to figure that out.
Thanks. I was going to invite you to maybe be a little less liberal about what a decision is. So, from one of Dana's comments about all of the cases where we don't have some prior decision, and in thinking about that, I was worried that your response to that might, meaning the response that says, well, it doesn't have to be a causal relationship. The prior decision doesn't have to have a...
Between what and what?
So the sort of, if you have a case where, right now I'm saying this, and it seems like it's in my control. So if you think that to be in my control there had to be some prior causal decision, then this right now would falsify that, right? So, you might have thought, and I thought this was where you were going, that no, the prior decision, the decision is just part of the right. And that seems right to me. But then I worry that the regress problem disappears, because I might think, well, there's a regress problem only if deciding to A and A-ing are different.
Oh.
But if they're not different, if it's just constitutive, if it's constitutive of deciding to A, that I also decide to A, that I also, right? If they're all just constitutive instead of causal.
Oh, well, that's, okay. I was thinking two things now. I was thinking of what I call the decision to be the first part of an action, which has a causal relation to what I call the result of the action. And again, I wasn't thinking of the decision as necessarily something prior to the action. There can be intentions. You can have decisions prior to the action. You can have a decision to do something later, but then when the time comes, you decide to do it here and now. And I take that to be the first part of the action. This business about the equivalency, or something like being between deciding to A and deciding to decide to A, I confess I don't really understand that. It seems like those decisions have different contents. I'm not sure what you mean by constitutive. If I make a decision, then it seems to me there's a content, an intentional content to that decision, which can be, and if it's a decision to, which A are we talking about, big A or little a? There's a problem here that I didn't allude to in the paper. We normally talk about deciding to raise one's hand rather than deciding that one's hand should rise. Now, the causal consequence in my picture of the decision is the hands rising, not the hands raising, right? And yet, I talked about deciding to raise, right? So there's a kind of self-referential nature to the decision there. So if what you're saying is the decision, the content of the decision is big A rather than little a. Excuse me. The content of the decision is big B rather than little b, right, when I'm raising my hand. There may be a case could be made, I'm not sure how it would go, that there is, the regress is benign. Maybe. And then maybe you could get the subjunctive conditional to work even then. I'm unsure just what it would mean to say that deciding to raise one's hand is equivalent to deciding to decide to raise one's hand. It strikes me that those are different, but maybe a case could be made that they are equivalent. Yeah.
Okay, this will be the last question.
I have a question also about your view of intentional omission. So, I mean, I gather the idea of executive decision is, so you put it, it's a decision to do something or other here and now.
Right.
So, and I gather that includes an intention, or it's at least in part an intention, what some people call a present-directed or a proximal intention.
Right.
So I wonder if there are some intentional omissions where one never has, or at least during some period when one's intentionally omitting, one doesn't have an intention not to do the thing here and now. So for example, Matt is going to Amsterdam next month, and you and I have decided not to go. And we will intentionally not go. But I mean, I don't think it need be that, say, you and I ever have an intention to here and now not go. So, you know, we just decide that now and we're done with it. We don't even have to be thinking about it in May, I think. And another example is, so my wife doesn't eat meat by choice. So she, but, you know, very seldom is she intending here and now not to eat meat.
Yeah.
But it seems, you know, that she refrains or she from eating meat, so that she intentionally doesn't eat meat. So anyway, it seems that those might be some kinds that don't fit the model of intentional omission because there isn't a here and now intention ever or throughout the period during which the person's intentionally not doing something.
That seems right. So I think that would require a further adjustment to the model that I've proposed. That's good. So you and Carolina have told me that I need, well, and others, that I need to rethink this model. Yeah, good. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's thank our speaker.